Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be looking into the Fear and Greed Index. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Fear and Greed Index. It's a market sentiment analysis tool. You can find it at this website right here. I'll link that in the description below if you're unfamiliar with it. But essentially what it does is it helps show you whether the market, market participants are feeling greedy or they're feeling fearful, or if it's somewhere in between. And you can see over the last month, it's basically been between neutral and greed. So a month ago, it was more or less neutral. Recently, it's been somewhat greedy, right? Last week, yesterday, and today, it's leaning in sort of the greed phase, whereas last month it was neutral, and of course a few months before that it was fear and extreme fear. And so the sentiment in the cryptoverse certainly ebbs and flows, right? We go from greed to fear to extreme fear, and we just sort of go back and forth, back and forth. But we also know that if you look at any individual value for the fear and greed index, it does not always tell you, it might not always tell you what exactly you're looking for, because it sometimes can be at extreme levels of greed or extreme levels of fear for a long period of time. To show you what I'm talking about, if we were to go look at the fear and greed index here, you can see that in 2020, the fear and greed index went basically to like 95 when Bitcoin was at like 19.5K, right? So the fear and greed index was in the upper 90s, even though the price continued to go up, more than three times higher than that over the next few months. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily the best indicator to use, say, like a single data point for, but it is interesting in the sense that we might be able to apply moving average to it. Now, I should say there's always an exception to the rule. I mean, yes, it would not have worked out here at a fear and greed index of 95. To really offload all your Bitcoin. But had you done so at a fear and greed index of 95 in the summer of 2019, it actually would have worked out quite well. So, I mean, of course, there's different ways that you can look at the data, but I do think one potentially interesting way to look at it is to apply a moving average to it. Okay, because in any given month, right, we can of course go to extreme levels of fear, extreme levels of greed. It all just depends on what's happening within the cryptoverse and price action mainly. But if you were to apply a moving average to it, so let's look at the raw values, apply like a 30-day SMA, and while in 2019 we did go to say like a fear and greed of 95, when you look at a 30-day SMA, it sort of topped out in the 70s, whereas a 30-day SMA of the fear and greed index back in 2021 topped out in the 90s. So there's a difference between going there for a very short period of time and then coming back down in sort of like a choppy year like we had in 2019 and also like we had in 2015 and probably 2023, and then going there and spending a sustained amount of time there like we did in 2021, like we did in 2017. Of course, this metric doesn't go back to 2017, but I'm sure that if it did, it would have been flashing extreme levels of greed, and in 2013 as well. So perhaps applying a moving average is a useful way to look at this. One interesting thing when you look at the fear and greed index is that in 2018, we sort of saw it hit a low here. Then price bounced up a little bit, and then price came back down. But while price was coming back down, the market wasn't as fearful, and sort of some type of market sentiment divergence, I suppose. And then we saw this rally in 2019. Something similar has actually played out over here, right? We saw a low here in June, and we called for a lower low in November. We actually had video about it, right before November happened, because I think a lot of people assume that June's the bottom, and this is what happened in Q3 2018 as well. But we often do see things push lower by the end of the year, and it did. But what's interesting is that it put in a higher low on the sentiment analysis, right? So on the fear and greed index, we put in a higher low, and then of course we've seen a pretty nice rally here in 2023. Not that dissimilar from what we saw in 2015, not that dissimilar from what we saw in 2019 as well. It's also interesting to note, though, that there's a phase in terms of like the phase of the cycle. I would still argue that we're more similar to 2019 and 2015 than we are to say like 2020 or 2021 or 2016 and 2017. I think this is sort of the long recovery year where we sort of just chop around. And I mean, again, like we saw this happen in 2019 where the fear and greed index went up for a while, and then we came back down. Note that when we came back down over here in 2020, the fear and greed index actually put in a lower low, at least on the 30-day SMA, and I believe it also put in a lower low when you just look at the raw data as well. I believe this came down to like 8 or something. Yeah, fear and greed index of 8. Whereas in December of 2018, the lowest it really ever went was around 9. So it actually did go slightly lower. And it went there pretty quickly because, I mean, it dropped from in the 60s, right? It essentially dropped from the 60s all the way down to around a fear and greed index of 8 within just the span of a few weeks. So sentiment can change very quickly within the cryptoverse. That's something we should all, of course, be very familiar with. Just note that it, of course, it will likely continue to change back and forth as we continue to navigate this year. I also think another way to look at it is with a 90-day EMA. I think the 90-day EMA is an interesting way to look at it because, going into 2021, when we were at 20K and the fear and greed index was already at 95 on the raw data, if you actually look at like a 90-day EMA of it, it would have only been in the 70s, where again, it ultimately went all the way up into the 84 level in this distribution phase over here. So I think the fear and greed index is a great tool to use. I do think that applying some type of a moving average to it might help clean up the data a little bit. Of course, it does introduce an element of a lagging indicator, right? Moving averages by definition are, of course, going to be a lagging indicator. But by applying a moving average, it can help tell you if it's, that type of sentiment is being sustained for a long period of time, and if you're seeing it sustained for several months, then we must understand that the market conditions are getting extremely risky, right? If it's sustained for very long periods of time. But anyways, hopefully you guys like the content. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed. Again, we do have the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.